Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, depending on the time zone you're joining us from. We'll begin today with a land acknowledgement. Global Rights for Women gratefully acknowledges the indigenous people of the lands we are on today. Even though we are meeting in a virtual space, it is important for us to recognize that we have benefited and continue to benefit from the theft and occupation of this land since before the United States was formed as a nation. Global Rights for Women is located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and acknowledges we are on Dakota and Anishinaabe lands. We recognize the discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous people around the world. Additionally, we understand the treatment of Indigenous women is a byproduct of colonialism, racism, and misogyny that has perpetuated the continued sexual abuse, disappearance, and murder of Indigenous women. Please join us in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harm of the past and present, and to consider how you can help dismantle continued oppression of Indigenous communities and restore justice. Since people are joining us from around the world, at this time, if you'd like to put into the chat the land that you're acknowledging, we'd appreciate it. Thank you for coming to Global Rights for Women's conversation series, Valiant Voices. I am Vayuna Gupta and I will be today's moderator. I am the legal and policy advisor for Global Rights for Women, an organization with the mission to end domestic and sexual violence around the world through systemic and legal change. Valiant Voices is a conversation series Global Rights for Women created that features human rights advocates and survivors who are addressing injustices and disrupting oppressive systems that cause harm. These are stories of leaders creating change in their communities and around the world. We are pleased to share that Valiant Voices is the 2023 recipient of the National Purple Ribbon Award for Outstanding Domestic Violence Podcast. This recognition for excellence would not be possible without our generous donors who support these conversations and the guests who bring their authentic selves, sharing their experiences, expertise, and passionate commitment to ending gender-based violence around the world. We welcome your comments in the chat or questions in the Q&A section on Zoom. In case your question is directed at a particular panelist, please mention so. After the conversation, we'll send out a link with the recording, and if you need a certificate of attendance, please contact us at globalrightsforwomen@grwomen.org. Today, we'll be talking about economic abuse. We recognize that there are survivors here. Parts of this conversation may be triggering, so we are including resources for people in the US and internationally in the chat for those who need safety and assistance. Please take good, gentle care of yourself during and after the conversation. I am pleased to introduce our panelists to you. Shamita Das Gupta is the co-founder for Manvi, the first organization to focus on violence against South Asian women in the US. She taught psychology, gender studies, and law at Rutgers University and New York University, authored 5 books, has written several academic papers and monographs, and conducts training for domestic violence and sexual violence practitioners in the US and India. Currently, she works with the Kolkata Foundation, a US-based organization that fights poverty and gender violence in West Bengal, India. In her retirement, Shamita is enjoying writing mystery stories in Bangla. Messi is a multi-award-winning thought leader and change maker with a distinguished record in championing economic justice and health equity. For the past 22 years, she has dedicated her life to advancing progressive policies on access to reproductive health, women's and children's health, global health research, financial empowerment, racial justice, and women's economic rights. As the visionary founder of the Canadian Centre for Women's Empowerment, she has been unflagging in her efforts to address economic disparities and dismantle systemic barriers that hinder women's economic achievements. Through pioneering policy advocacy, groundbreaking research, educational initiatives, and programs preventing economic abuse, Messi is at the forefront of this critical work. Her primary mission is to shape public policy and legislative decisions that empower victims of economic abuse to achieve economic independence in Canada. Messi is dedicated to bridging gaps in existing approaches to combat economic abuse. Her commitment to societal empowerment extends beyond the Canadian Centre for Women's Empowerment. She is also the founder of Maternity Today, an organization dedicated to sharing evidence, resources, and advocacy tools for healthcare workers. Messi serves on the board of directors at the Centretown Community Health Centre and the END FGM Canada Network. She is actively engaged as a subject matter expert by various World Health Organization task forces, serves as a policy advisor for the Network for the Advancement of Black Communities and the Governance Committee for the City of Ottawa's Community Safety Wellbeing Plan, aimed at addressing poverty, systemic racism, gender-based violence, and mental health challenges youth and their women face in Canada. Noreen Walani, Director of Programs at the Domestic Abuse Project, draws on her vast experience leading clinical teams in nonprofit settings. Dedicated to anti-oppressive impact and dignity-centered engagement, Noreen specializes in addressing trauma, domestic violence, mental illness, and chemical use through integrated therapeutic methods. Trained in EMDR, AirNet, Sandtray therapy, and DBT, she navigates her role adeptly, ensuring clients receive personalized support. As the Director of Programs, Noreen makes a substantial contribution to the organization's mission of addressing domestic abuse with empathy and expertise. Pavina Yang is a first-generation Hmong refugee. She was born in Thailand and moved to the United States when she was 6 years old. She has 7 siblings, a lot of nieces and nephews. In her free time, she likes to watch movies and try out new food. She graduated with a BSW and has been in the advocacy field for 3 years. Advocacy has been a part of her life, and it is something she's passionate about. Thank you, Noreen, Pavina, Shamita, and Messi for joining us today. Today's conversation will be about what individuals and systems can do to practice survivor-centered, trauma-informed responses that respect and support survivors of gender-based violence. 8 in 10 survivors of domestic violence cite financial abuse as their primary barrier to leaving an abusive relationship, and 99% of them experience it. The average survivor has access to only $300 in assets. That's why financial dependence as a means of controlling partners through withholding money and controlling credit, employment, and assets is so effective. The impact of economic abuse on self-sufficiency can become a lifelong struggle, impacting where someone can work, live, get credit or not, support child-parent relationships, and sustain good health. Far too often, people individualize recovery from financial abuse as a household or budgeting issue. Yet, systemic policies and practices, including racial and gender inequities and cultural norms about money management, make people doubly vulnerable to economic abuse from both the partner and institutions. It's imperative that systems advocates, workplaces, and banks understand the seemingly invisible dynamics of intimate partner economic abuse and how changing practices that result in unequal power dynamics can give survivors the economic empowerment they need to lead lives free from violence. So this is a question I have for any of you, and any of you is free to pick it up. And it's sort of an opening background question, which is, how does economic abuse impact a survivor's ability to leave an abusive relationship and establish independence? And with this, can you also share and talk more about common tactics that you've seen abusers use to exercise control over finances?
May I address it just to give it a...
Yes, Shamita, yes.
Okay. Thank you, and greetings to everybody. And thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this conversation. It's a very important conversation. So I just want to kind of give talk a little bit about the lay of the land, so to speak. And I know that the other colleagues here will talk a lot more about tactics and exactly what happens. But one of the first issues I think we must realize that the financial restrictions we witness in an abusive relationship are really extreme manifestations, the same ones that are often present in the regular gendered intimate relationship. When an intimate relationship is violent, economic abuse is generally expressed as, I think, one is coerced deprivation of access to family income. And I think, Vayuna, you've already talked a little bit about that. And there's also a deprivation of wherewithal to deal with money. B is, I would say, the second piece is the deliberate withholding of knowledge about finances. And the third one is withholding the opportunities to develop financial skills. Now, it may also include creation of fear around handling of finances that may lead to actually self-restriction in dealing with money. So not just from outside, but it's instilled so badly inside us that we hold ourselves back from it. Now, by access to finances, I don't mean just access to family bank account, but family finances will include assets such as stocks and bonds and annuities and life insurance, retirement plans, pensions, stock options, real estate, family businesses, all of those. And by financial knowledge, I mean a solid grasp of all of the above, but also knowledge about debts, taxes, child spousal support, and various other obligations. And the skills would be the ability to manage and handle all of these so that the survivor can live without damage to her current or future financial survival. Now, financial abuse emerges from, I believe, three sources: cultural, institutional, and individual. And you've kind of mentioned all of these, but let's look at it a little bit more details. Now, the cultural prescriptions of norms of what is appropriate for which gender sets the stage for the creation of gender-based rules, regulations, and practices of institutions. And both culture and institutions shape individual behaviors and actions. Now, our cultures have defined the female gender role to exclude proficiency in money matters. Dealing with finances is assumed to be a men's natural ability, therefore it should go to them. And now I'm talking about in very general brushstrokes. Of course, there are exceptions to all of this. Now, it's not very long ago that agricultural land and family businesses automatically went to sons. And in many places in the world, it still does. Without male heirs in the family, these might go to son-in-laws, but not to the daughter. We still don't urge our daughters to learn from childhood the nitty-gritty of finances and how to handle money. That's just not in the cultural rearing practices, child rearing practices. Now, undoubtedly, severe financial abuse may delay or end the survivor's bid to leave an abusive situation and choose a life that is violence-free. Now, financial abuse has a tremendous impact on survivors' ability to become self-reliant and make competent decisions about her own and her children's safety. Often she's compelled to remain in an unsafe relationship or even life-threatening situation to shield herself and her children from poverty. Even if she leaves, the lack of financial resources may force her back to return to the same relationship. The fear of dealing with uncertain finances in the future forms individual barriers in women's path to living violence-free lives. Now, I'm sure so many others are here and they're experts in this area, would talk a little bit about the tactics abusers use to financially hobble women. I just wanted to give you a little bit of general background on this, and I hope I've been able to do that. So I'll turn it over to you, Vayuni.
Thank you, Shamita. No, I really appreciate you pointing out the financial knowledge inequity between men and women in the society just holistically, and more so fed by cultural and institutional reasons. Thank you for that. Would any of our other panelists like to add on to this? Messi, would you wish to talk about how economic abuse impacts a survivor?
Hi, can you hear me? Sorry.
That's
Yeah.
okay.
Sure, yeah. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Messi. I located on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation here in the capital region of Canada in Ottawa. In terms of the tactics, probably I would love to share some of the most frequent form of tactics, what we see every day from the victim sides. So especially employment sabotage is one of the most important thing what we need to also consider, which is usually we don't talk about it. So one of the tactics is sometimes perpetrators deliberately withholding women not to go back to school, holding her car key so that she cannot have transportation, denying her to spend her money on gas, so that basically restricting her mobility so that she cannot go to the workforce. And then, of course, harassing and then sending a text message at workplace and telling her, hey, you didn't cook, you didn't take care of the child, and kind of those threatening messages all about employment sabotage. So these are the tactics what we have seen. We also had report on global economic abuse response, so we included this issue as well. And then the other tactic is as well, especially when a woman on maternity leave, as you know, abuser best friend is isolation. Women are already isolated during childbirth. So that's also a very critical time to take her all benefits and monies during that time, because women are already isolated. They have their own emotional struggle with a new baby. So I think that's also another kind of things that's also one of the things we always experience. And then also we told us victim after they recover from postpartum as well. So I think those are the most important tactics we need. Of course, dragging divorce paper, as you know, that's also another thing. Denying child support, blaming you, gaslighting. It's all about those kind of tactic. And we also mostly this time we see a lot of victims reported that they had a lot of traffic ticket fine. So when women start to leave, abuser deliberately take her car, and committing crime, financial fraud, you name it. So when a victim leaves that house, she has to deal with all those messes and everything. So this is what we experience every time in Canada. Of course, it also applies everywhere.
Thank you, Messi, for discussing the multiple kinds of tactics that abusers use to control a survivors financially. The list is long, very, very long. Nareen, my next question is specifically for you. So based on your first-hand experience offering direct services to survivors, what barriers have you observed women encounter when they seek help and navigate their journey?
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I come from the land of Dakota in Minnesota, and so I'm grateful to be here. I'm also grateful for everyone who has taken the time to be present today. I honor and value the wisdom you bring, your experience, and your understanding. Thank you so much. I think the piece that gets really interesting about this work is the intersectionality in which we do. So how economic and financial abuse shows up looks different for different people. We talk about it as gendered, but I also want to kind of honor the fact that people who are men are also experiencing it, and also people in the LGBTQI community who may maybe identify differently as being non-gendered or gender fluid. And so tactics are tactics. And I think what we see that really gets in the way starts early and starts in almost small ways. It can be something as simple as someone doesn't return to the workforce after having children and is staying at home. And then what happens is that when it comes time to leave, you have someone who doesn't have access to getting a job, doesn't have access to finances. And then you're sitting there and saying, okay, if I leave with my child, what am I going to do? This is something that a lot of women come to us with. They sit there and say, I can't get a job. How am I going to pay for my house? Then you start to see the other pieces. The house, the apartment, the rent, the lease is all in the partner's name, maybe. The car, the bank accounts, the utilities. Maybe there are credit cards taken out in her name, and now there's these large outstanding balances. And then they're sitting there with having people come serve them with judgments saying, hey, you owe this money, and they have no way to get any funds. And it's very scary sitting in the house, hearing a bang, bang, bang on the door, and there's a sheriff who you're already afraid of because you've been told not to trust people. You're told that you're alone. You're told that no one's going to believe you. I've had so many clients talk about like when they are the victim of this abuse, they're not only the victim of abuse, they are told that if they were to say something, they would be blamed because they may be yelled or they may be screamed and deserved it. And so you have this narrative underlying a society that really functions on credit, your names being on things. In Minnesota, to get a real ID, or in the States, you have to prove who you are. If you don't have an ID, and your name is not on a utility bill, and you don't have access to like showing that your house, how do you get that? How do you get an ID? How do you leave? What do you do about childcare? Childcare is very expensive. Like if I'm going to have to go work, how am I going to pay for it? Simple things like you get up and you leave, you maybe take a go bag, but then the partner won't let you come back to get their stuff. And even if they're getting an escort, I've watched women try to go back to their homes, and even their family, the partner's family members are sitting there and saying, well, no, you can't take that out item or clothing. And now they're here with like maybe one or two outfits. They have no clothing, they have no food. Maybe they have access to like mementos that are valuable. We have jewelry, we have keepsakes. There's going to be this idea of like, there are women who actually are working. I worked with women who are actually the breadwinner in their family. And oftentimes when there's economic abuse, they're not believed because they're like, well, you're the fill in the blank person who makes all the money. How could that be? That person doesn't even work. And then all of a sudden you're caught because you're the breadwinner, you're making the money, but you have no access to your money because maybe all the bank accounts are in the name, or maybe you're tapped in because you're paying all the bills. I've seen men charge up credit cards, create debt. I've seen women do that as well, where it keeps people trapped because now you have all these high bills and you can't leave. And then you also are seeing, like, especially women who are confident and competent and strong, they're not believed. And so you add that dimension of like that financial piece is so insidious and starts. I think Shamila did a good job pointing out like access to education, access to being able to work. When you have a job, I think Memi did a really good job talking about men are calling you. You're in danger of losing your job. Someone takes your work computer because you can't do that right now because you have to do this other thing. Then you're getting in trouble for your outcomes. So there's all these slight things that add up to this really big picture. But I think the hardest part for all of the clients is the not feeling believed and not being seen, because it's not one big thing. It's a pattern of all these small things that are interlocking that keep you in a net or keep you in a cage. And leaving is scary because you walk away with nothing. And financial security is completely tied into physical safety in the world these days. So, yeah, I know my teammates here will share more, but just kind of give you a little bit of a lens of what I'm seeing.
Yeah, Noreen, you make a fabulous point when you say that it's a pattern of small things, and because it's a pattern of small things, it's so difficult to identify it until you're so deep into it that this is a concern or this is an issue. So thank you for telling us and pointing out all of those important things for us. Messi, my next question is for you, and building on what Noreen just said, can you discuss some systemic obstacles, and these may be policies, institutional frameworks, societal norms that victims of economic abuse encounter when attempting to break free from economically violent situations?
Yeah, thank you so much for this very important thing. But first of all, as you know, I'm at the forefront to build even international coalition from coast to coast in the world to bring economic abuse in the top agenda. And then I'm so honored and then proud to join this conversation, because this conversation is super timely, because number one, as you know, the post-pandemic struggle is still so huge with many survivors, the inflation, the pre-existing course date, many victimized struggles. So I think having this conversation is a very, very timely intervention. Thank you so much. So through our advocacy, we always mention that economic abuse is all about systemic barrier. We lack systemic infrastructure. That's how women are victimized multiple times. You name it, from the bank, justice system, community, you name it. So I would love to shape my conversation from the systemic perspective, because that's how my organization is also focusing. So there's a lot of systemic barrier, as you know. So one of the huge barrier, what we hear, not only in Canada, but from coast to coast across the world, is access to justice. So the justice system is very complex and it's very hard to navigate. As you know, the nature of economic abuse by itself, it's very complex to even detangle the situation. So unfortunately, even our existing policy lacks specific provisions of legal protection to address economic abuse. And then that makes very challenging for victims either to protect themselves, even like to speak about this issue to the court and the legal system is very complicated. I can share you in Canada, usually our lawyers are not even well aware about the complexity of, economic abuse. So we knew that in many countries also these things happen, because I had also a chance to attend the United Nations, the Status of Women Commission. I attended few sessions. Even most of the time, those lawyers who practice in family law, they may not have a details understanding of the complexity of this issue. So access to justice is very, very challenging. So the second thing is, what we have seen is there is a fragmented service delivery. So we need to have a one-stop shop services for our victims. So that services will really help for them not to re-victimize and then not to kind of traumatize, so that women, they can get the services in a very coordinated way. So unfortunately, the current institutional framework with the social service agency, you name it, legal, financial institution, they are so fragmented. And there's a huge gap specifically addressing this issue. So I think that's also another thing. And in addition to that, victims also encounter the bureaucratic handles, inconsistent response, especially from credit collectors, insufficient coordination among service providers like doctors, social workers, consumer lawyers. They are now working together. So that's really, really affecting victims to heal, to thrive, and then to build their economy. So this is a huge systemic things we need to work. And then the other systemic barrier is, we know we normalize somehow gender equality, inequality. So unfortunately, because of the structure, because of social norm, economy is all about power. So unfortunately, because of this societal norm, the patriarchy, it really, really exacerbated the situation, because especially from the racialized culture, immigrant community, racialized community, as you know, money is owned by a man, so the power is already taken care of by a man. So that kind of structure is also another layer for victims to detangle the situation after, especially after they leave separation. And the cultural attitude, and in some also culture, men is more favored. Even in some culture, you don't allow to talk about finance unless if you are a man. So that's also another thing, it's very hard for victim even to talk about their financial thing, because in some culture also finance is a private matter. So being like finance is a private matter, gender-based violence, and also financial abuse, that makes it more private, even the issue. So the social and cultural complexity is also another thing. And then in terms of the community barrier is a stigma and victim blaming. As you know, in many cultures, divorce by itself, it's a taboo. And also the victim blaming, it's continue, especially that affect women not to seek assistance, even to disclose their experience. And then victims may feel like judgment, disbelief. And then also that's why we have a lot of underreported cases of economic abuse because of the stigma of the discrimination in the community. So the other barriers, of course, policy and institutional policy that perpetuate economic disparity, such as unequal pay, childcare, limited access for affordable housing. It's not only affordability for housing, but accessibility. So many women kind of discriminated because, number one, they are victims. Usually landlords, they don't trust them because this woman, she's already broken, she don't have money, she's abused. You know, there's a lot of bias among landlords. In Canada, we are advocating for that right now. And then employment. Many women after abuse, as you know, there's a sporadic employment history. It's very hard for them to get a job. Flexible job is also another thing, especially for single moms. And then accessing to financial resources as well. Bank, as you know, bank is very, very bureaucratic, and it's very hard for a woman, number one, to talk about a designated trained bank employee as a financial institution is also a huge barrier. So all these things keeps victims trapped in abusive relationship, as you know. And then the language barrier, of course, for migrant and newcomers in Canada, we have seen that refugees, newcomers are highly exposed of economic abuse because of systemic factors. Unfortunately, our immigration law is also perpetuate. For example, if a woman is sponsored from Yemen by a man, so unfortunately, there is some laws that favor the person who sponsored her, and many women, they left, victims of this form of violence. So there is a lot of sectors has to be addressed. And then the other sectors also healthcare, lack of access to mental health service, also one of the issue. Of course, mental health is a taboo in many cultures, but what we have seen is, especially Indigenous and Black community in Canada, and of course across the world, mental health is one of the huge problem many women they have been dealing with. Number one, access. Number two, women, they don't want to disclose, because if she discloses she has a mental health problem, she may lose her child custody. So unfortunately, the legal sectors and the health sector, they are not working together in our context. So for many women, number one, to seek a doctor, they are not willing to do that because of the fear of losing their children. So it's kind of a very complex thing. So that's why my organization right now addressing the systemic reform, institutional change, dismantling systemic barrier, promoting gender equality, empowering victims' financial dependency and security is the most important thing. So I think let me stop because I'm gonna actually put some resources probably that really helps for people who are attending this conversation today.
Thank you, Messi. You pointed out so many systemic concerns: healthcare, justice systems, patriarchy, financial institutions. It's sort of an indication that we have so much work to do, and we are not even close to addressing economic violence, let alone gender equality in the first place. Pavina, my next question is for you. How does the Domestic Abuse Project address the intersection of economic abuse and homelessness amongst survivors of domestic violence? And is there any specialized support that is provided to them to help them regain financial stability, secure, safe, or sustainable housing?
Yeah, again, thanks everyone for having me here. Excited to be here. So we know that when a victim leaves an abusive partner, they are most vulnerable. While we don't know what the abusers are capable of, we also know that they're capable of anything and everything. And we also know that, victims are at risk of losing the financial support, risk of being homeless, which is why it's very important to have specific programs and services for specific groups and population. At the Domestic Abuse Project, housing is, a crisis need for everyone, and particularly victims of domestic violence. And we have this program called a coordinated entry system. It's CES. What that is just a program that has a pool of multiple housing providers across Hennepin County. Our role is to enroll participants into this priority list. That priority list looks at vulnerability. It doesn't make sense for someone who isn't urgent to be waiting at the same pace as someone who is very vulnerable, you know. So we look at that priority list looks at, are they pregnant? You know, how long have they been homeless? Are they family? Are they single? Are they youth even? So we enroll that into that program, and then once a housing provider has a matching availability to our participants, they will help them look for a rental unit, help them pay rent for a few months after that, and then it gets them back on their feet so that they can be stable for themselves. We also help with other things like protection orders, you know, helping victims keep themselves safe from their abusers, to have no contact with them. We also help with things like lease break. If you need to leave your house or home and you can no longer live in your rental unit, we help with that. Small things like installing a camera could even, you know, help you in court, or make a case if you need to report something. Yeah, so we do the best that we can. We do have limited capacity, you know, we still a lot of works that needs to be done, but those are some small things that we do help with.
Thank you, Paveen. I know that's a lot of help. Like every sort of support that you provide to survivors, I'm sure definitely assists them as they move out of an abusive relationship. So thank you for doing all of that work. Shamita, I have another question back to you. So you co-founded Manvi, and it was the first organization of its kind to cater to South Asian women in the US. And in your work, have you noticed any distinctive patterns of systemic economic abuse which are particular to the South Asian community? And can you tell us more about them? And have these sort of patterns or observations that you've had changed over time? Is there a difference from then versus now?
Thank you for the question. It's a very interesting one. Now, as I've said before, and I think all my co-panelists here have talked about it in some details, but essentially, women nearly in all societies and classes are basically systematically removed from developing competency in the financial world. We find, and particularly in South Asian communities and families, even when women make money, they don't necessarily control it. And now, I also think very strongly that it's not just an individual matter, but rather culture and institutions are complicit in restricting women's financial roles in society. Now, what I think is very interesting is a recent study from London School of Economics found out that after divorce, a woman's household income falls by 20%, whereas a man's rise by 30%. This is the household incomes they looked at. And a 2021 study, which was published in 2021, but it looked at the data they collected was from 2004 to 2014. And it's all, by the way, not just South Asian, it's from all, that women over the age of 50 who divorce experience a 45% drop in their standard of living. Well, men's drop also, but it's only 20%. It's a very interesting study, I thought. Now, this situation is aggravated in South Asian families as a cultural norm is that men will handle money. Even women who are highly skilled and earn fat salaries tend not to control their earnings. This is, by the way, true for South Asians in the United States as well, immigrant women and the community. Women are brought up with the overt message that they are not good in handling money, or they don't have a head for making financial decisions. Now, women may control daily expenditure of households, but they end up having no knowledge and control over the family income and financial assets, which I've talked about a little bit already. Now, I'll share with you the situation in South Asia. And I think, Vayuna, you mentioned that I work with a group called Kolkata Foundation. And a recent study surveyed a survey with about 700 women conducted in Sundarban area in West Bengal, India, and found very interesting results. It's a poor and agricultural society. The overwhelming majority of the participants confessed to being physically and emotionally abused. 90% of the women, although it's an agricultural society, didn't own any land. Only 11% said that they could make decisions on spending their own earnings. 87% said they don't have any control over the decisions made in the household. And 66% said that their money was controlled by someone else in the family, husbands and in-laws. And these women were poor, and most hadn't completed high school. But the situation in a more well-educated, affluent immigrant community here in the US, of South Asian community, that's not much. I didn't find it much better. Particularly, I'm talking about the women who are abused and battered. I've worked for South Asian immigrant women in the US for nearly 40 years now, and found that at best, most hand over the reins of family finances willingly to their male intimate partners, or at worst, are coerced to surrender their finances to their partners. And when women decide to leave abusive relationships, the majority of abusive partners vengefully make it their life's mission to deprive them of all financial resources. They will actually go after them to make sure that they don't have. Women lose not only all finances, but they may lose jewelry and other assets that their parents had gifted during marriage. The common threat of abusers is, if you leave me, I will make you beg on the streets. So immigrant wives even lose the assets they've left behind in their own country. Not only do they don't get equitable share of the marital property, but they lose any property they brought into the marriage from gifted from parents. When women are abused in transnational spaces, that is, the husbands have migrated for work, and the wives are left behind. And this is a case for a large number of South Asians who go back and forth due to in the workplace due to work. Financial abuse actually takes very complicated proportions and very enormous proportions. The money the husbands may send back are generally sent to the parents, his parents, and the wife has little or very restricted control or access to it. Thus, her position may end up being reduced to that of an unpaid maid in the household, totally dependent on the in-laws or other in the family that she's living with. And when women migrate with their spouses on dependent visas that don't allow them to work, their financial dependency actually heightens the abuse and their helplessness at the same time. So really, the systems of this country don't necessarily safeguard survivors of violence. Now, you asked a very interesting question whether this has changed. And yes, peripherally, I think on the rim of the whole issue, we do see a little bit change. I think when I first started working, women would not come out to talk about their own abuse. And now I see more, and it takes less time for women to come out and talk about abuse. But dealing with money and thinking about it or controlling it is still considered crass behavior for women. At best, it's not important. At worst, it's crass behavior, selfish behavior. They end up being dubbed as money hungry, selfish, if they want to have control over their over the family finances. And I am talking about not everybody, but abusive relationships. But even in the best of marriages, you see the men controlling the finances of the household. And so the culture around finances and women's gender role expectations have to change in some very significant and deep ways. Otherwise, it's really unlikely that we'll see some deep changes, significant changes in the financial abuse that we experience and women experience. And far from it being eliminated, I think it still is there, and it only gets expressed when there is abuse and a woman tries to leave. But the stage is set even beforehand in the way the gendered relationship and marriages are.
Thank you, Shamita, for all of those points. I personally think there's this very quotable line that you said, which is women are systematically removed from developing competencies in the financial world. And I'm just going to take a couple of seconds, but say this. So a couple of years back, like 2 or 3 years back, there's this online money transfer application called Paytm in India, and they came up with they had an advertisement for International Women's Day that particular year where they asked questions to a group of men and women. And if the answer to that question was a yes, they had to take a step forward. And if it was a no, they had to take a step backward. Initially, the questions were very basic. They spoke about, did you learn how to bicycle when you were young? Did you go to school? And things like that. And then eventually they started getting about finances. And women started taking a step back and men kept moving forward. And the difference was so vast. So it is true that financially, I think culturally in multiple cultures, it's a thing that we tend to believe that women will not be capable of handling their own money, irrespective of their educational or financial contribution into the family. Okay. So we have a couple of questions coming into the chat. And I see that we just have 10 minutes left. So we're going to move there. Pat, can you take the questions from the chat?
Yeah, we have a question that I think I'd like to pitch to Noreen, which is, why are abusers mostly male? And what can schools and teachers do to prevent victims?
I think that's a fantastic question. I think it's multifaceted in its response, and I'm not going to pretend to answer all the parts of it because it is a vast question. One of the things that comes a lot as I do a lot of education on DV 101 and we talk to stakeholders, we start with this video that talks about like, why do women stay? Right? That's like one of the central points. Why are women staying? Why are women staying? And there's this lovely video that talks about why are we asking why women stay and why aren't we asking the question, why do men abuse? And I think one of the reasons we continue to have this split is because our focus tends to be after the fact. We're trying to support victims after they've been victims. And so like today, we talked a lot about like, what is it that goes into a culture? What goes into a systemic parts of it? What cultural changes do we need to make? What systemic changes do we need to make to create a different outcome? So that's one part of it. One part of it is that we have to change the way that we talk about gender topics. We have to increase access to everyone to be able to be financially literate, to increase access to understanding different components. But the other thing is we also need to start also having interventions to prevent people to men. And so one of the things that DAP does that makes us unique is that we not only provide services for those who experience abuse, but it's also for those who use abuse. And it's like really doing a deep dive and getting and working with people who have used abuse. And it's getting them to increase accountability, humility, and empathy, because those are the 3 elements that help decrease. And so when you talk about doing interventions, we have to start with like, what are the legacies? We talk about intergenerational trauma. We talk about cycles. We talk about what people witness as children. And so then the other intervention is also working with children who have experienced domestic violence. And so the answer is a systemic one, right? We have to take part of all of the work. We have to look at those who've experienced it, both men and women. We have to look at behaviors. Some of the research shows that certain behaviors that men engage in indicate even worse adverse outcomes. What are we doing to intervene there? What are we doing at young ages to create a different culture of what does it mean to be healthy? We know we talk about patriarchy, but patriarchy is damaging not just to women, it's damaging to men. And there's harm done. And so the thing is, we're also growing up and creating a culture where there isn't what it means to be a man, what it means to be powerful. Just had someone share in a group context that, you know, he was told by his mother that if, you know, if a woman's going to act like a man, then you treat her like a man. And that was so interesting because it means that there's this idea that men act in ways, in a particular way. So and so we have to address that male toxic culture as well. And so when you talk about education and teachers, it starts young and it starts with communities. The answer to a lot of these things is these are community answers. We talked, Messi, you talked about isolation. Shamitha, you talked about the culture. We have to start understanding that domestic violence is a community problem. It impacts all of us. And the way that we change it is by addressing it from a very young age. Oh, boys are just going to be boys, or they just acted this way. How many times have we said, oh, he must like you because he acts this really toxic way? We gotta move away from being okay with those cultures. I can say a lot about this. This is something that's very near and dear because I think the whole family does better when we work with the whole family. Um, because because culture and systemic change only happens when we address culture and systems.
And that's a great segue for another question that we have in the chat, which is directed to Messi. And the question is, what is a policymaker's appetite for addressing economic abuse at a systemic level? What's been your experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. But before that, I saw a very, very interesting question. Somebody asked about nutrition, because economic abuse is not only finance, it's not only economy, it's your basic essential needs like food, clothing, medicine. These are critical things. So I'm a witness of this form of abuse at many levels. I can share you. In pandemic, one of the indigenous women in Canada, she was abused. She's a senior person. She was abused by perpetrator. He denied her not to access her fridge and her food for 3 months in pandemic. So this woman, she ended up with a lot of medical complication, diabetes, and you name it. So this woman, because of the restrictions of accessing her food from the fridge, she ate for 3 months a popcorn, just butter. So you can imagine like the health impact. So this woman, she ended up with chronic disease. I know there's also studies come out last year from British Medical Journal, the association of income inequalities, and then this form of abuse on the nutritions. And of course, like, you know, other form of like chronic disease. Of course, a lot of research has to be conducted, but I'm a witness of a woman who have been impacted by denying her food, by denying access of her basic necessity at her house. She ended up with that. So we share the story in public. I remember our website was visited 20,000 times in a week. So this was kind of the thing we need to talk about it. Economic abuse is not only finance, it's also food. I have seen also women was denied not to spend their money on sanitary pads. I have seen also disabled women. She was denied not to buy a wheelchair battery because she can move, she can make an income, right? So it's kind of a very complex and very tricky and then a coercive behavior. So we shouldn't focus only finance. When people ask me about economic abuse, I'll tell them, hey, it's not finance, it's also beyond that. So I love the question. Thank you so much for someone who asked that question. Yeah, nutrition, food is one of the things. Even some perpetrators denied a pet food. Like if a woman lives with her own pet and puppy or dog, whatever she have in her house, deliberately they will hold even not to feed, to punish her. So this is also another forms of like, you know, abuse, what we encounter every day. So I just would like to that. So back to the policy question. Yeah, as you know, the system is a lot. I personally, I always argue with my supporters and advocates, it's very hard to push women to fit in the broken system. So those women, they are very resilient survivors. They have a lot of passion. They're very creative. They're very, very strong. But what they lack is a systemic thing. So the first step of system change is changing the mindset of policymakers. So we spent almost 6-7 years to have this conversation. Even I know Canada is one of the countries, they developed a lot of negotiation agreement for United Nations this year. We don't want to see economic violence. We want to clearly articulate economic abuse. The 3 forms of economic abuse has to be clearly articulated in all policy documents. Policymakers also, they have to say it loudly. Otherwise, it's very, very hard to change the mindset of the decision makers. And then, so what I would like to say is, we are amazing policy change right now in Canada, of course, in UK and Australia, because we have a global coalition. I can speak also on behalf of the coalition. So in UK right now, economic abuse conduct, the code of conduct is implemented by many banks. So this code of conduct is one of the game changer for financial institutions to respect women, to provide a trauma-informed service, to provide a trauma-informed product. In New Zealand also, they have amazing program. In New Zealand, they call it economic harm, not economic abuse. Some countries have their own language. So in Canada, so what we did is we have our national task force dealing with this work. So their main role is exploring the existing best practices and barriers. And then so they analyze those information and then we'll come up with some key policy recommendation for decision makers. It was not that easy, truly speaking. Systemic change is not just like one system. There's a lot of systems. So we're trying to raise awareness from coast to coast in Canada and across the world. That's why I put it November 26th as a global now days. Many countries also following that day. So that enables us, number 1, to include economic abuse on our national action plan in Canada. Number 2, to include economic abuse clearly on the national financial literacy strategy, because education is a key. We need to educate young girls when they are high school about unhealthy financial relationship. That should be the bottom line. So if I were educated when I was young about dating violence and unhealthy financial relationship, I will have the power to mitigate the impact and the consequence. So that's why we focused on financial literacy strategy. And then the other thing is we're asking recognition day for each city across Canada. So we are making sure that all city mayors and decision makers to be more accountable. So we're working on that. And then the other work is we have a very big housing coalition across Canada because homelessness is one of the issues, especially for those women. Their credit is damaged. It's very hard to get a housing. In Canada, to have a housing, you should have a good credit check. You should have a deposit. You should have someone else who could, be a guarantor. It's impossible for a victim. So the femicide rate is high. I don't know if you know the statistics. So we are aggressively working on that. So in addition to that, as you know, coercive date is one of the huge barriers for a woman not to live abusive relationship. I know in California, there is a new bill introduced, I believe, 2-3 years ago. It's basically to protect human traffic survivors. So in Canada, we replicate that best experience. And in Ontario, which is the province I'm in, we're asking government to change some of legal reform to protect victims. Let's say I have a coercive date because of my abuser. So the credit collectors, they can give me a relief. So that's what we are right now. We are doing aggressively. Probably that's also another thing you can, replicate and then reach out like, any advocacy group. I think that's really, really solved a lot of work. And in addition to that, data research is very, very important. We need to invest on research because policymakers, they just need a story and they need data. So without data, it's very hard to bring systemic change. So we need to kind of invest and then bringing all sectors together and then also engage essential service providers like telecommunication, utility agencies, even governments. Like government, for example, if I want to leave my abusive relationship, I may have my marriage certificate, education credential with the abuser. So when I went to the government to get that, even my driving license, I have to pay back them. So we were asking government to make sure they are also accountable. So we need to come up together collectively and dismantle those barriers and then change the narrative. So we need to start to talk about survivor wells. Survivors should have a wells, not they shouldn't be live in poverty. So that's kind of the narration right now. We are educating also media as well. As you know, finance is a taboo. nobody talks about it. So I think I talk a lot, but hopefully you can see a lot of things. But you can join us at Global Coalition. We'll share a lot of resources, guides, toolkit, and everything. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Messi, for all of those resources. I'm sure that it'll be super helpful for audiences. I see that we are at time. So I'd like to thank our guests for talking with us today and our participants for being here. I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Patricia Kambi and Sophia Kulo, for ensuring that the conversation went on smoothly on the technological side. We've included links in the chat to learn more. And if you would like to support global rights for women, your contribution goes to supporting the work of advocates around the globe, centering survivor voices as a means of achieving systemic change. You will receive an email in the next few days with resources as well as a link to the recording. Once again, thank you so much for being here. It was an honor to share this space with all of you.